Good afternoon or good evening if you're watching from Moscow or elsewhere in the Russian Federation or in Europe. Welcome to this edition of the Scott Ritter Show. A lot has been happening in regards to the conflict in Ukraine. There are news reports of Royal Marine involvement on the ground. There's talk of Patriot missile deployment. But one should never forget Clausewitz's maxim that war is an extension of politics by other means. And by other means, what we could be talking about here is the economy. Before there was a ground war in Ukraine, there was talk of the United States deterring any potential Russian military operation by threatening the imposition of economic sanctions that were supposed to be massive and that were designed to bring down the Russian economy. This did not happen. Instead, we saw a jujitsu reversal, so to speak, by the Russian Federation, turning the tables on those who impose sanctions. And yet today, sanctions play a critical role in the strategic thinking of the West when it comes to how to contain Russia in Ukraine and reverse Russia's gains in Ukraine. Just recently, we saw the West speak of a price cap on Russian oil exports. So even though a lot of the attention is focused on the battlefield, I think it's time we turn our attention to the other side of this conflict, the economic war. And there's no one better to discuss this with than my guest today, Mikhail Kazin, a noted Russian economist, somebody who has numerous appearances on Russian media, and somebody who is the author of a economic theory called the theory of the modern economic crisis. So I want to welcome Mr. Kazin to the show, and let me just start off. Are we in an economic crisis today because of the conflict ongoing in Ukraine?
Yes, but Ukraine is a secondary element. And this economic crisis happened just long before Ukraine and before 2014. Let's start from the very beginning, from the broader picture. First of all, we need to understand that in any country there are different elite groups which have different interests. In the USA, there is an elite group which is associated with the foreign bankers, international bankers, who are interested in maintaining Bretton Woods system, which includes a big number of elements. IMF, the World Bank, WTO, and other different organizations. It has gone under some changes since 1944, but to a particular extent, it still exists. Along with that, the global dollar system for the United States still exists. And there is a key indicator which demonstrates the value of the system for the United States. In 1944, the share of the American economy, the manufacturing part, what American so-called added value, accounted for more than 50%, around 52 to 53% of the global economy. Then it went down, and today it accounts for around 18%, and the optimistic and pessimistic is 14%. I'm talking just what the American manufacturing output is, not what it consumes. It consumes more. It consumes of around 1/3 of the GDP thanks to printing US dollars. And quite a long time ago, it was clear that if the United States kept maintaining the global dollar-based system, it would be very expensive for the United States. I would like to know that the international bankers don't care about that at all. They can move to London, to Melbourne, to any place. They don't have any problems with moving to a different place. The problem is about the real sector of the American economy. In 2014, on the 4th of November, United States, there were interim election where the Republicans won the majority. On the 4th and 5th and Tetron, there was Dartmouth Conference. This is a special format created by Mr. Kennedy and Khrushchev after the Cuban crisis, which was closed in 1991, and in 2014 they renewed this conference. And on the 5th of November, we opened this Dartmouth Conference session discussing this election. And then I said that there were two basic scenarios, baseline scenarios. One baseline scenario was that the United States maintained the global dollar-based system, and then they would destroy their real economy. This second option, the United States would try to revive its real economy globally, but they need to give up the dollar-based global system. And I said that from the perspective of the American people, and in 2014 there was no one even talk about the falsification. From the perspective of American individual, the first scenario was associated with the Democratic Party, and the second scenario was associated with the Republican Party. It was not right, maybe, because there were advocates for the first and the second scenarios in both parties. The Democrats, the most advocates supported the international bankers, Clinton, Biden, Obama, but in Republicans, there are not many of them who supported these international bankers. It's a very sophisticated issue. I do not quite know well the domestic balance of powers inside the US. So the electors believe that the Democrats supported the dollar-based system, and the Republicans supported domestic real economy. So there was a high probability that those powers supporting the national economy of the USA, based on the elections results, who had enough power to so-called nominate their person as the candidate for the president in 2016, and the person had a good chance to win that campaign. I'd like to draw your attention that the Trump appeared there several months after that, at the beginning of 2015. And his motto, "Let's make America great again." This is the motto, which means let's revive manufacturing part of the US economy. This topic had been voiced before. Congressman Ron Paul, Rand Paul, his son of his, was a senator at that time, talked about that even beginning of 2000. And that topic was covered. And that was discussed and voiced by non-trivial but famous American thinker, Lyndon LaRouche, who passed away at the age of 96, but who kept on saying about the physical economy, talking about manufacturing sector particularly, but in the American management establishment, managed by Washington, and not part of that. I'd like to note a very interesting point as well. In the United States, there is a big stuff of intelligence, officials of mid-level. I saw the situation in 2014, November, when the Russian delegation in Dartmouth Conference paid a visit to the State Department. I'm going to tell you this story, but if you tell me, I will share this story. I saw how they know who is who. These people somehow are so kind of restricted in their ability to make decisions. The decisions is made by the higher political elite, and this political power mostly makes the decision based on the multinational banks' interests. That's what Trump said. But from the perspective of the logic I have proposed, Trump had a very big drawback. As a former official, he has two drawbacks. He just a weak official. That's what he didn't manage to somehow work with the deep state. It's not the power of the deep state, it is the weakness of him as an official. In the same situation, Ritter Nixon, the end of 1960s, 1970s, built the Washington system, and they just moved along the lines he proposed. Richard Nixon was a genius. I believe that it was the last greatest president of the US. Someone believes that it was Reagan. It was not the case. Nixon had his own policy, but Reagan had conducted the policy created by Paul Walker. And the second weakness of Trump was that he couldn't afford himself to say that the global dollar-based system should be terminated, since it cost a lot to American taxpayers, American people, and American economy. Have a feeling that today's the establishment of the United States understands that. I'm just looking from a different angle. So I have a feeling that in Washington, in the United States, they have made a decision that the Biden's team with his international bankers should leave. And the real manufacturing economy should be revived. Within AUKUS, not the US only. Whether it's going to be success or not, this is a separate topic. Now we're talking about the strategy behind. But this scenario is quite possible. And of course, talking about my personal opinion, any DeSantis will be a more effective implementer of this, a facilitator of this strategy rather than Trump. But this is an additional thing. But the key point is the following. It is absolutely necessary for the United States and for many other global powers to destroy the dollar-based Bretton Woods system. And then there is a question. If the United States agrees to terminate this system, in this particular case, they are deprived of the tool to control the world. Another thing that this format is very expensive. If they are deprived of the tool to manage the world, to control the world, they need to look for allies who will patrol and maintain those regions where the United States without the dollar-based system won't be able to reach. This is the reason why the US is trying to hold negotiations with different countries which are quite powerful. This is Russia, India, China, Turkey. The only country they don't want to talk to is the EU, and it is quite clear why. First, if the United States want to have industrialization with AUKUS, they don't need to see any rivals in the European Union, and the European Union is totally controlled by those international bankers, which just put in as an obstacle to the economic reforms in the United States. The European Union is a major adversary or enemy of the United States in this case. China is a regional leader, Russia is a regional leader, India is a regional leader, even Brazil is a regional leader to a particular extent. But the European Union wants something bigger. It means that it should be terminated as an economic entity, as an economic power. And today we witness that Ukraine is a tool. The US regards sanctions in a very creative way. We impose sanctions here, then we abolish the sanctions, here we impose sanctions, but then there are some loopholes and so on and so forth. The EU imposes very strict sanctions, and as a result, it loses a lot. In fact, the EU is disappearing from the global economic map as one of the leaders. And I need to say that the price of gas in the US is 3 times lower than in the EU. I believe this is the perfect operation, which demonstrates high quality of the American executive branch of power quality. But Ukraine, within this scenario, is not interesting to the US. So, as for Russia, the situation is quite simple. Russia is a regional leader, one of the biggest powers, getting this status back. You know, big and powerful states should have the right to the security area, and Ukraine is a part of the security area. When the US faced these issues, they just moved deliberately and without thinking. You know, according to 1970s, 1980s way of thinking, nothing has happened. But at the same time, the bankers who are deprived of a part of the area feel upset, feel offended. But you can do anything about that. For decades, they have been controlling the world and the United States. They have been controlling the issue of money. In 2007, 2008, it was clear that they were not capable of maintaining bigger living standards globally thanks to this issuing methods. They tried to do this in 2011. They wanted to deprive the United States of the right to print money, and the US retaliated. That was a kind of protection act. It was clear that the bankers wouldn't succeed. I do believe that the US acted absolutely in the right way, following their national interests. But then, what is happening is just another evidence of that. The crisis was inevitable. For long ago, our first book, The End of the Dollar's Empire and the End of Pax Americana, was issued 20 years ago in 2003, and the theory of crisis, detailed theory of crisis, was published in 2019. The Russian book is called The Memories About the Future, and in English version it's called different way, but you can buy it in Amazon in e-copy. So everybody who wishes can buy this book and read this book.
I have a follow-on question for you, if you don't mind. I mean, what you're saying is fascinating because from a layman's perspective, my perspective, the Biden administration, a Democratic administration, which, according to your theory, is a money printing mode as opposed to developing the economy mode, they plan sanctions against Russia that have not hurt Russia, but instead destroyed the European Union. Who is responsible for the destruction of the European Union's economy because of this sanction program? Is it the United States or is it Russia? Was Russia a genius in how they handled this? Or is this the United States being incompetent? Because it's a Democratic administration, but according to you, they're promoting a Republican policy of America First economy. What is it? Genius on the part of Biden? Incompetence on the part of Biden? Genius on the part of Russia? Indifference on the part of Russia? And why is the European Union playing along? They're the ones suffering.
You see, the key mistake made by many political scientists, I'm not a political scientist, I'm an economist, and I'm a specialist on the public governance. I had very high positions in public governance. In 2016, I wrote a book about the theory of governance and power. So from our perspective, the miracle is that you shouldn't look at the countries, but you should look at the elite groups. In the United States, there is a competition between the elite groups, national and subnational, which are controlled by bankers. In Russia, these groups are also present. We call them liberals and patriots, but in the European Union, the patriots do not influence the situation at all. In the European Union, the bankers rule. If we look at the policy of Mr. Biden, it is double-sided. On the one hand, he is trying to keep the US dollar system alive. The bankers promoted him and they are responsible for that. On the other hand, the interests of the United States play a very important role, and the biggest majority of the American officials follow the interests of the US. Therefore, the idea that you need to take the financial assets, the investment and the industrial assets from the EU has been very popular in the United States for a long time. I'm absolutely positive that the operations to terminate the economy of the EU through sanctions regime was a prepared by American administration operation. But whether the key organizers of these operations behind Biden's administration's representative, or there was intelligence, the military people, I'm not sure about that. We need to look into that, but we need to investigate that. But I haven't done it yet, but this topic is very, very interesting. As for the mistakes, which role will be played by sanctions against Russia, it is easily explained. The point is that the whole economics and the expert economics of the United States is based within the financial capitalism which was built after 1981, Reaganomics, which de facto reached its end in 2008. But it's almost 40 years, and over these 40 years, the American economic system was based on the financial system. I faced this situation a lot in the 1990s when I worked in the Ministry of Economic Development and Administration of Yeltsin. And then, someone in the United States understands that, Rand Paul, he understands it perfectly well. I talked about that in 2000 with Lyndon LaRouche, who explained to me that starting the reign of Nixon in 1970s, the bankers took under the control the economic education field, and most officials and economists do not understand that the economy can be different. The whole focus, the whole miracle about the sanctions is that people who evaluated and assessed alleged pressure of sanctions against Russia based their ideas on the logic before 2008. But the economy has changed a lot. It is not a financial economy, so-called. But if we use ideological words, it is not liberal economy anymore. Today's economy is turning more of a real sector economy. That's the reason why the sanctions haven't impacted so much. That's what my idea is.
Now, let's talk about Russia for a second. Why have the sanctions failed against Russia? What makes the Russian economy invulnerable? And we know that this isn't by Russia doing nothing. Russia has literally been compelled to divorce itself from the West. Almost a total break in economic relations between Russia and the West, and a requirement for Russia to pivot to the East and seek markets elsewhere. Was Russia anticipating the Biden sanctions? Did Russia have a strategy in place, or is this just a matter of luck? Why is Russia succeeding when the entire West is trying to make Russia fail?
First and foremost, because the role of the West in global economy is lower than the West had expected. The West believes that the global that the dollar-based system exists, so the US controls everything. But the share of the United States in global GDP is lower than 20%. And if we add the EU and everything else, Japan, 40 maximum. This is less than 50. In 1944, only the US accounted for more than half of the global GDP. And in this particular situation, the attempts of the United States to put restraints and constraints on Russia is not supported by other 60%. And Russia accounts for not a very tiny part. Officially, we have around 2% of the global GDP. But in earnest, it's about 8% of global GDP. GDP is a kind of accounting indicator, formal accounting indicator. For example, from the perspective of the United States, the drop of the stock market 3-4 times is a catastrophe, and from the perspective of the Russian economy, the 10 times drop in the stock market is not a problem at all. Economy is different. This is the economy of the real sector, the real economy. And that's true for the whole world. In China, the economy is based on the real sector. In India, the economy is based on the real sector. The same is true for Africa. And that was the main reason for wrong assessment and evaluation. You know, in Russia, there is still economic decline. It used to be 2-3% before, and it's still the same. But there is no drop, since the Russian big part of the economy is the real sector. And the real sector has increased. The investment in the Russian economy has increased, but the stock market has gone down. It doesn't have a big impact on the Russian economy at all. In the United States, the huge market, the market value is big indicator, since these are collateral assets for the investment loan and for the operating loan. But in Russia, this is different. The collateral assets are real estate. And this is the reason why to assess the Russian economy from the Western standard is a wrong thing. But it means that the experts who did that in the West are not qualified enough to do that. In Russia, we had a lot of experts who explained that the sanctions wouldn't have a big impact on the Russian economy. But if you asked Ron Paul, he would tell you that it's all nonsense. Not only Ron Paul. In the US, there are a lot of people who understand what is going on. The other thing that in the economic hierarchy, they do not hold high positions. They are not awarded with Nobel Prize. They don't take the position of the chairman of the Fed, the head of the Treasury, and so on and so forth. That's the life.
Well, this is fascinating. You know, in the West, we often mock Russia as a gas station disguised as a country, making fun of Russia's dependence on their energy sector. But based upon your analysis, that's not a bad thing, because the gas station, the Russian energy-based economy, is a real economy, the real sector, as opposed to the speculation of the financial sector. So am I correct in saying that Russia's dependence on energy is a strength, not a weakness?
Just look, I'm going to give you two stories. The first story happened in 2010, 2011, when in Astana Economic Forum I talked, during lunchtime, held by the Prime Minister of Kazakhstan, I talked to the first Vice President of ExxonMobil company. We talked to him about the crisis, about the Syria crisis. 2008 was over, and he asked me what I was doing. And I told him, since we had lunch, I showed him a fork, and I told him, just look, today you can exactly say how much energy this fork is about. It's about 22%. And the role of ExxonMobil company. And I told him at the very beginning that he was the CEO of a big company, the biggest company, he said. That was 2 months before ExxonMobil lost its top value to Apple company. The real sector economy was replaced by the digital company as the biggest value company. 22%, I said. That was the energy of the fork. Now there is a crisis. The crisis has started, he said. He understands that crisis was in place 2011. And the question, I told him, just tell me, after the crisis, the amount of energy in this fork, will it be 17 or 32%? He just thought for a while, maybe it would go up. If now it's 22%, will it be 27 or 35%? Do you understand? This is a big difference. Please don't explain to me, he said. I understood it quite well. I'm the senior vice president of the company. I understood what the energy was about. And now, can you imagine that if the energy part in the fork amounts to 25%. What is the role of this energy sector, of the hydrocarbon sector in general, from the very beginning till from the production till the end product? Because this steel welding is about energy. Production of fertilizers, of hydrogen fertilizers is about energy. The bread you eat is about energy. Because without fertilizers you cannot have bread. Particularly about these gene-modified seeds which are used today, they give bigger yield because you use a lot of fertilizers. This is one thing. In other words, the role of energy will be higher and higher, and it is increasing. The second part is the reform made by Obama. You know, not many understand that, but Obama conducted a very fascinating economic reform in the United States. Everybody knows about Obamacare reform, but nobody knows about economic reform. It is not written about what he did. I'm going to explain to you in detail. He tried to ensure that the energy costs among companies in their economy should drop, so that would be able to use additional investment into new technologies. And he did it. But then it turned out unexpectedly that the share of energy-producing companies invested in development, and which after this reform they couldn't afford anymore, the value of oil-producing companies, ExxonMobil companies, went down. And it was bigger than the money which was invested in the development of companies from other economic sectors. And the economic growth went down as a result of that. And this analysis was only possible based on investigating the structure of the domestic economy. That's what we have been doing for decades. And in the United States, this kind of research is not the case at all. That is the reason why mistakes happen. So today, I can give you different models within the foundation of the economic research named Mikhail Kaz. I can give you this approximate structure of the prices after the crisis. I do understand the share of the energy sector. When I talked in 2011 with the senior vice president of ExxonMobil, I said that I started that research today. This research is over and I have models which can give you exact answer to this question. But in the United States, such models are not conducted, and this is the reason why your monetary officials make decisions based on macroeconomic models, which are created using the logic of 1990s and 2000, before the crisis of 2008. These models do not work at all. They do not describe the real sector. And that's what Saudi Arabia understands, India, China, and Russia, partially. This is the reason why the action of the US, of political nature, that's what they have done to the EU. This is a political decision. Sanction is about politics, successful politics. The capital from the EU fly to the US, and now the US is actively encouraging the real economy and manufacturing producers from the EU to the US. But the economic action is not that successful. But I'm not doubtful that in the United States, in the years to come, there will be a change of economic paradigm, economic model. But how long it will take and where you take the specialists to do that, this is a separate question. I don't know the answer to this question.
Well, history will show us. Let me end with this final question to you. Looking forward. We're in an economic conflict right now. On one side is the money printing world, so to speak, the United States, the European Union, the G7. On the other side is the real sector world, Russia, China, Brazil, India, Saudi Arabia, South Africa. In effect, the G7 versus BRICS. Who's going to win? And how long is it going to take economic victory to be achieved?
I'll tell you. In 2003, we wrote a book, The End of the Empire of the Dollar and the End of Pax Americana. I'd like to draw attention to the fact this is the name of the termination of the Bretton Woods system, not the United States. This is the destruction of the Bretton Woods system. In this book, we wrote that the collapse of the dollar-based system was inevitable, and that should be collapsed into the different currency systems. And there were 5 countries could be leaders of their currency zones from the east to the west: South Africa, India, Russia, China, and Brazil. In several months, Goldman Sachs described these countries as BRIC and then added South Africa, and it became BRICS. So the economic sense of BRICS is the alternative center of currency zones. We don't have much time. Unfortunately, I will not go in detail and explaining why we code these parts of the dollar-based system split into currency zones, because to revive self-reliant company can be just through issuance of these regional currencies. So it is clear, 20 years is over, that the EU will not exist. Eurozone will not exist. What is going to be Latin American zone headed by Brazil is a different question. I'm not sure whether it will. When Bolsonaro took the power with the help of Steve Bannon, it seemed to me that Latin American currency zone was over, was dead, but silver is back. We'll see how it's going to end up. So far, we see 4 countries which can become currency zones: the US, Russia, India, and China. So within this system, there's going to be a new world built. These regions will not compete against each other, since they will need to revive self-reliance and self-reliant economic systems. I would like to reiterate that the world faced that at the end of the 19th century. The world had 4 independent, to a particular extent, economic systems with its own currency, with its own economic model. The US, Great Britain, Germany, and Japan. They competed after, then there was a Soviet area after 1930. But Nevertheless, today we need to admit that there is a collapse of the dollar-based system, Bretton Woods system, and it is in the interest of the United States. This, over the last decades, the beneficiaries of the Bretton Woods system were multinational banks, which just use the United States, and that's what many American politicians said. And today, the United States have just explained this is their current currency zone is AUKUS. The US, Canada, Great Britain, Australia, New Zealand. Maybe something else will be added. There was an attempt to include Japan. It's whether it will be successful. This is separate topic. This is about politics, not economy. But we need to consider one more thing. Lyndon LaRouche, who is a prominent American thinker, kept on saying that the US is mostly ruled by the British Empire. I'm not going to discuss this statement of his, we don't have much time for that, but I would like to remind you that the main economic mechanism which was used to manage and rule the world over the recent decade is the mechanism of interest rate. This is the control over printing money and control over credit, which is the control over the interest rate. But in the British Empire, in the 18th and 19th and the beginning of the 20th centuries, the control was effected through pricing, through fixed prices, like in the USSR. But the war for independence at the end of the 18th century was associated with the fact that the Great Britain prohibited the colonies any manufacturing at all. The colonies were to buy agricultural tools from Great Britain at a fixed price by the British Empire. That's what caused the war for independence. So today's action conducted by the United States, in case of China against Russia, which is oil price cap, this is shift from the credit management to price management. And in this particular sense, I do not rule out the logic of LaRouche that the people who created that are not in Washington at all, but in London. And that may be a right logic behind, being American patriots. I would be very concerned. Who will dominate in AUKUS, Great Britain, or the United States Commander-in-Chief of the Australian and the Australian armies is a British monarch? I do not know the system quite well, how it is really. I'm just voicing some hypotheses that shouldn't rule out that the role of London will be at too much from the perspective of the interest of the US.
Well, thank you very much. Again, my guest today has been Mikhail Kazin. You've given us tremendous amount of food for thought. I appreciate it. You've shown light on a very complicated subject. We follow what's going on in Ukraine. We deal primarily with the military and the geopolitical. Very rarely do we get an opportunity to delve in depth into the economic aspects. But based upon what I learned today, it's definitely a mind that needs to keep being mined. Knowledge is power, and today I believe we got a lot of knowledge. So hopefully we all emerged powerful. Thank you for joining.